March the 27th at the Local Health Integration Board meeting, the LIIN Board passed 3 motions. The first motion was split into 2 parts. Part 1A was aimed at the Scarborough Hospital, and they were told to come up with a new vision for the Grace campus at the Scarborough Hospital. The second motion was that the Scarborough Hospital and Rouge Valley need to get on with the implementation and planning around the creation of a regional maternal child youth program as contemplated in the 2009 Clinical Services Plan. So that was the first motion. The second motion was again aimed at the Scarborough Hospital, and it said, stop doing anything unless you ask us for permission. That's just me paraphrasing, but that's what it said pretty well. And then the third motion, which was the bombshell, was that effective immediately, TSH and Rouge Valley should start planning for integration of frontline services, back office, and leadership and governance. So that came as a complete surprise to everybody, including us, and as well as the Scarborough Hospital. So since then, we've been trying to figure out what all that means. And we don't have, quite honestly, a lot of clarity at this point in time. So we're working with the LIIN and the Scarborough Hospital to try and figure out a process to answer that question. What does that mean? We've had a couple of meetings. We've met with the board of Rouge Valley. We've had a couple of meetings with the board chair and CEO of the LIIN and the Scarborough Hospitals. And that's kind of where we're at. We have a draft framework for a plan to how we're going to answer the last question or the last motion. We've got 60 days to do that, 14 of which are pretty well passed already, or will have on Wednesday. So the objective is to have that framework agreed by the end of this week. Once we've got that, then we'll have a bit more clarity around what we're going to then do for the next 45 days and what this all means. So that's about it. You now know as much as I know. So the question is, if we're going to be, so is this aimed at Rouge solely? So the comment I made was that, I made a comment on Friday, that this is not about the breakup of Rouge Valley, it's not about the Ajax campus being transferred to Lake Ridge or anybody else. So one of the things we have clarified is Rouge Valley is Rouge Valley is Rouge Valley, and as a minimum it'll be what it is today. And from a day-to-day operational point of view, we will continue to do all of the things that we've been doing for the last few years. And we'll continue to work on all of the projects we've identified as critical projects for this year. So the bed map and collaborative care and staff mix changes, etc., etc. All of that stays. We're not going to stop and wait to see how this planning process shapes up or what it shapes into. Does that answer your question, Pauline?
I'm just wondering if it's geared specifically to Scarborough Grace campus in Rouge Valley or the Scarborough Hospital in Rouge Valley.
As far as we understand it, it is aimed at integrating services in the Scarborough cluster or the Scarborough community. So it would look at all of the services that the 3 existing hospital sites deliver today.
You're speaking of integration. Can you clarify what the term integration means?
So the question was, what does integration mean? That's a really good question, and it's one that we don't have the answer to. So integration could mean anything from just trying to think of an example. So the cardiac program that we operate here is fully integrated with Scarborough Hospital in Lakeridge. Their physicians come and do their interventional cardiology work here. We operate as a regional program. That's an integrated program. It could be something as simple, that's not simple, but it could be something like that, only on a broader scale, right the way through to the other end of the spectrum in terms of it could potentially be a joining together of the two hospital corporations. But we've no idea what the answer is at the moment, and that's what the planning process is supposed to figure out over the next 60 plus days.
So what is Central East LIIN's interpretation?
And the question was, has the LIIN defined what it means by integration? And the answer to that is no, not in terms of the outcome that they're looking for from this process. If we look to the legislation which talks about integration, so there's a piece of legislation called the Local Health System Integration Act, which is the legislation that governs all of the LIINs. It talks about various types of integrations, one of which is called a facilitated integration, which is what the LIIN has asked us to go through. And that basically means they're going to bring somebody in to work with all three parties, but primarily TSH and ourselves, to figure out what the answer to that question is. And we don't have an answer at the present time. We don't know what the least amount of integration is, and we don't know what the most amount of integration is going to be. So it's a work in process.
Does that mean, do you understand what the frontline services are? Can you break that down for us?
Nope. You've seen as much as we have. Frontline services, we are interpreting, both hospitals and the LIIN, are interpreting that as everything that we do as a hospital.
So, okay, not just the merge, not just something like that, it's everything.
Yes.
What about the back offices?
That's everything. That's everything we do in the back to keep the front office going.
I know, but we're not all aware of that. So
No.
Got like HR, that's
yeah. So finance, HR.
foundation.
Not foundations, because they're separate corporations.
Okay.
But yeah, anything like HR,
Payroll.
purchasing, payroll, all that stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. So the question was, what does frontline services mean? And the second part of the question was, what does back office mean?
And along with that, because you've got them in bullet points, is leadership in our governance. Does that mean there's going to be one CEO for the entire, like,
So it doesn't mean that is the case, but clearly the question is being asked, how are you going to lead and govern these organizations going forward? So that's a question that's on the table. There is no answer.
So are any other hospitals in, are any other hospitals in the area?
So the question there was, are any other campuses in Scarborough being asked to look at integration with any other organizations? And specifically, is the Grace being asked to look at an integration with anybody else? And the answer is no. This is focused directly at TSH and Rouge Valley. Question at the back, and then there's another one over here.
This almost seems like a done deal. And my question is the 45...
Okay, so the statement was, this sounds like a done deal, and are we making preparations to take over the other ship? So as far as I'm concerned, this is not a done deal. We have no idea what the deal is. And the next 45 to 60 days is really about figuring out how we're going to answer that question. So there is no done deal, and we're not going to be integrating services within the next 60, 90, 120 days beyond any that we were already in the process of integrating or working on already. So, you know, we're going to continue with cardiac care. If we can move a maternal child forward, then we will try to do that. But again, it's a planning process defining what it is we expect to have at the outcome, not to actually do the integration. It's going to take us longer than 90 days to actually integrate any of the services.
When you say TSH, do you just mean the general campus or both campuses?
No. So the motions were aimed at the corporations, so it said Rouge Valley Health System, so that applies to both our campuses, and TSH is both their campuses, the general and the Grace. So we will need to be looking at, from a Scarborough perspective, how we deliver services for Scarborough amongst the 3 campuses in Scarborough.
One more question.
Yep.
There are unions involved in the Frontline staff.
So the question there was that there are unions involved at both sites, and and they're not necessarily the same unions representing the same classifications of workforces, and so how are we going to deal with that? And the answer is, I have no idea right now. That's becoming a familiar answer. You should be able to sort of anticipate some of these. I have no idea how that will work. There is no framework in the province for dealing with a large integration of 2 organizations with multiple unions. There has been in the past, but there is not one on the books at the present time that I'm aware of, unless Diane is going to correct me.
I was just going to say there is language in the collective agreement about integrating across hospital sites.
Okay, so
There is legislation that gets enacted.
well, there's legislation that could be enacted,
Yes.
depending on, but it's typically, I think that was aimed at where there was a broader sectoral integration,
Somewhere there's not union.
as opposed to just 2 hospital corporations. But Diane says there is some language in the collective agreement, so
I have one question.
sure.
The 4 months is referred to in motion number 3. It appears to occur after the 60 days. What's that time?
So motion number 3 has 2 timetables within it. So the question is, what are those 2 timetables? The first one is a 60-day timetable, and the objective of that is that 60 days is, my understanding at this point is, that's the timetable for planning for how we're going to plan. The 6-month timetable, which started at the same point as the 60 days, so therefore 4 months after the first 60 days, is to have a plan for integrating whatever it is we decide we're going to integrate.
So is that the time frame that the integration should occur?
No, that's the timetable when you'll do the detailed planning. So I would imagine, and this could all change next week. We could have another one of these next week, and this could all change. I would imagine that physical or work integration, if any, would not start for another 6 months at the earliest. But I'm guessing.
The primary reason for the integration, was it to downsize the organization or to expand some of the services?
Okay, so the question is, the primary reason for the integration, was it to downsize services or to expand services? Since we don't know what that looks like, it's pretty hard to answer. But I think, any of us, I commend you all, first of all, read the newspapers, read my blogs, read what's happening in the industry. The reality is, irrespective of whether we get a change in government or not, the province has a big financial problem. We're running big deficits in the province. We can't afford that unless we all want to volunteer to pay substantially more taxes. Anybody want to volunteer for that? So, healthcare is about 42 to 50% of all the money the province spends on an annual basis. If the province is going to fix its deficit, it's going to have to constrain how much it spends on healthcare. And I've written on this. We've put stuff in the ECHO and everything else. The reality is, for the next 3 to 4 years, hospital funding in particular is flatlined. The best we can hope for is zero increase. The reality is it's probably going to go down. So from Rouge Valley's point of view, we have to deal with that. And that's the same for the Scarborough Hospital. They have the same issue. Revenue's flatlined. Our costs aren't. Our costs continue to escalate. So at some point, we don't have enough money to keep meeting the payroll. Now, we don't have enough money to keep meeting or offsetting those increasing costs because there's no increase in the revenue. So we have to find ways of doing things differently. And that means we're going to have to organize services, whether it's within Rouge Valley or within the Scarborough cluster or broadly in the province differently, so we can continue to afford. That is a reality.
Is there a chance that Scarborough Hospital has been having some pretty significant financial issues? Is there a chance?
The statement was that the Scarborough Hospital has been having some financial challenges, and are we going to have to help out in terms of if we're in a better financial shape than the Scarborough Hospital? So the Scarborough Hospital actually has not had that big, not had huge financial challenges. They've had break-evens, financial situations for the last few years. They do have a big working capital problem, but they've had that problem for a while. It's not new. And they, like us, and like most of the other hospitals, are facing an increase in costs over the next few years to the tune of about 3 to 5% a year, with no increase in revenue. So their projections, like ours going forward, are that we've got to absorb that 3 to 5% increase. Now, to put that in dollar terms, 3 to 5% is somewhere between 11 or 12 to 17 million dollars a year that we have to find at Rouge Valley, and a similar number at Scarborough Hospital. So that's the magnitude of the challenge we face as an organization and they face. And I think one of the questions on the table is, by combining the way we deliver services, can we find ways more easily of coming up with those sort of savings? And those savings are similar to the ones that are needed by many hospitals in the province.
Is Central East LIIN going to...
Well, the question is the Central East LHIN going to help us financially to integrate services? The answer again is I have no idea. Given the overall financial situation, I don't think the ministry, who is the one that provides the money to the LIIN, is going to be writing big checks to make this happen. I'd be very surprised. I mean, obviously we're going to look for, if we are going to integrate things, we will want to look for opportunities to get, one time as a minimum funding support to offset some of the costs. But I don't think we're expecting a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not sure it's a merger yet. So the question was, what's my opinion and how do I feel about this? This merger was the term used. So I don't know whether this will or will not be a merger. So that's yet to be determined. How do I feel about it? I think we have huge challenges, and I think we've been saying now for a while we're starting to run out of runway on our own to solve those challenges. So this may be a way to help us offset some of those challenges for the next 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. That's kind of where my head is at the moment. Am I rabidly enthusiastic about the whole process? No, because I've been through this before. Whatever we do, however we integrate things, however far we go, these are really complex, difficult things to do successfully. And so we'll have a huge amount of work ahead of us if we're going to make it work. Hi.
So I'm more interested in the how to,
It's a great question. So the question was, and I'm going to paraphrase it. If I get it wrong, just tell me. How are we actually going to make the change happen? And in particular, if we go back to the peer review report from 2007, it was clear that we had a lot of challenges internally in terms of our culture being a barrier to success. And what have we been doing to try and change that culture? And what will we continue to do? And how are we measuring the changes? That's a lot of questions. So I think you've all been involved in a lot of the work we've been doing around changing the culture, and part of the changing the culture process has really been getting more people involved in, frankly, running and designing the processes that we use to operate the institution. We've had some success around the financial stuff, and that is again a reflection of culture as well. So I think we've got a more engaged workforce. I think it's continuously a work in process, so we have to continue to do that. I think we've got frankly, I think we've got, as an organization, more self-confidence and a more positive attitude. Certainly when I came here in 2007, there was a view in the organization that we couldn't take a decision and make it stick. And I think we've come a long way from that. I think we're pretty good now at getting some views around, you know, what we want our future to be, and taking some decisions around that and actually making it happen. So I think we've done a lot in terms of how the culture's shifted. In terms of how we measure that, I mean, there's various tools that we use, but certainly the amount of people, or the number of people that are engaged in LIIN activities, the number of people that are involved in process improvement. We measure employee engagement using tools like NCR Picker. It's not my favorite tool, but it's a tool at least. And we've seen some improvement over the years. And again, it's a work in process. And you know, all of these things will be a challenge going forward. I mean, integrating two different cultures in any two or more organizations is a big challenge. So how we're going to do that, I haven't figured that out yet, honestly. You know, I've had these motions for just under 2 weeks, 10 days. I haven't figured out the action plan yet, and when we do start figuring out the action plan, you'll all be asked as well. So we'll need as much help as we can get right away throughout the organization.
Question: how much of an effect, if any, will it have on this site?
What impact will it have on this site if we go through with some sort of integration? So I think that the impact on this site is minimal for a few reasons. First of all, you know, depending on who you listen to, the growth of the CE development is often running and about to accelerate. There are more rumors and innuendo that the airport is about to become a reality, and each of those on their own will have a significant impact on the number of people in Ajax Pickering who require service. So as a minimum, just by organic growth, this campus and this facility is going to need to respond to the growth associated with that. I think it's no secret to anybody that, you know, Durham has been relatively underserviced over the years, and certainly the new funding formulas that government is using for healthcare would tend to shift resources into Durham. So again, I think that's an advantage. So I don't see any downside, Walter. I think there's the upside that exists just because of growth in the community. Good question. We've been, as part of Motion 3, we've been asked to develop a plan, and what happens to it then? So we have to jointly take the plan back to the LIIN Board, and at that point, the LIIN Board will review the plan and make a decision as to whether to accept it or not. So that's the first step, 60 days out. So the statement come question was the LIIN must have a view of what it wants to get out of this. So what happens if we go back in 60 days with a plan that the LIIN doesn't like? So that's a good question as well. We are trying to do this in such a way that the LIIN is engaged as part of the process. So we think there will be some sort of steering committee set up which the LIIN will sit on, although not necessarily be a member of. And that steering committee will work with the facilitator that's appointed. And hopefully through that process, between the facilitator and the LIIN, that will ensure that we don't go down any paths that the LIIN doesn't want us to go down, or government doesn't want us to go down, or that don't make sense from a community point of view or whatever. So hopefully we don't waste 60 days and put a plan on the table that nobody agrees with. That would not be a very useful thing to do. And the question is, if after 60 days the LIIN is not in favor of the plan, will they force us to implement the plan they are in favor? And I have no idea the answer to that. And it would become a very complicated thing because there are different levels of legislative jurisdiction as to what the LIIN can do and what has to be undertaken by the ministry. So the LIIN has only certain powers, and one of the powers it does not have is it cannot force hospital corporations to merge, for instance. That's actually a reserved power of the Minister of Health. So if we got to that situation 60 days or 6 months from now, I think we just have to see what the response was. Hopefully that isn't what happens. The question is there an integration like this happening anywhere else in the GTA? I'm probably going to get this answer wrong because I'm going to say no, and then somebody's going to come along and say, oh yes there is. But I don't think there is right now. There was a similar thing that happened in a different way between the Mississauga Hospital and Credit Valley Hospital, and that was about 2 years ago, 18 months, 2 years ago. But that was a voluntary process. The two hospitals got together and said it made sense to form a single hospital corporation, which they did, and that was approved by their LIIN. But it was purely voluntary, whereas this is technically called a facilitated integration, which is a particular part of the LIIN legislation, and it means that basically somebody's going to stand in a room and help TSH and ourselves figure out how to get together in some way, shape or form, yet to be determined. And the person who's going to do that is yet to be determined as well. So, great question. We have a pretty active community, and will they be notified at the same time we are? We're trying to keep them informed just as much as we're trying to keep you informed. We did obviously start with you guys, although I must admit I had a pre-scheduled presentation at Durham Region Health and Social Services Committee last week. In fact, it was the day after the LIIN announcement, or maybe a week after the LIIN announcement. And they spent most of their time asking me questions, just like you're asking me. So we we've started that engagement. We will be going back to the various municipal reps. I've spoken personally to all of the mayors and the chair, and we will be continuing to have them fully engaged in the process. Again, we're still trying to figure out the process, so once we've got that a little clearer, then hopefully we can have a better discussion and engagement with them as well.
Rick?
Yes?
The formality of the process does require stakeholder consultation within that 6-month period.
Correct. So both the LIIN motions as well as the legal framework, the legislation, requires community consultation through any integration process. So there's actually a legal requirement, and it's also stated in the motions too.